When we talk about Trump and the media, so it's not just Trump and the presidency we're talking about, it's Trump and the media specifically. A lot of the discord, a lot of the unhappiness, a lot of what people are talking about has to do with the way he treats the media. It's not only how he treats the media, it's how the media treats him, whether it's social media, whether it's print media, whether it's television, streaming news, you name it. All those things are included when I use the term press or the media. Freedom of the press is a basic national commitment. The idea that the press is supposed to have the opportunity to do all the things that the Founding Fathers wanted to do is something embodied, enshrined basically in the First Amendment to the Constitution. Donald Trump is not going to run it off. Congress is not going to run it off. You're not going to run it off. It's a part of the Constitution of our country. So government cannot stop basically the press from doing what it's supposed to do in terms of its functions and responsibilities. Certainly the Founding Fathers never intended the media, the press, to be a publicity arm or to be a marketing arm or a branding arm for the government of the United States or for state and local politicians or anybody else. It was designed basically to hold them accountable so they would do the things that they were supposed to do given the rule of law in this country. The partisan function was always a part of that First Amendment statement, and that's what basically the Founding Fathers thought would happen at the beginning, that basically the press would be a part of the newspapers. The press is always charged with bias, whether it's liberal bias or something else. But today, in terms of the evolution of social media especially, they specialize in being biased. Everybody says, well, the media should be neutral, right? Should be fair. That's not necessarily correct. But somewhere in the 19th century, we began evolving to this model, this new model, where the press was basically, well, to a great degree, it has to do with corporations and economic capitalism and a number of other things. They gravitated, they migrated toward a model basically that would appeal to more people. So obviously they could be more successful. If you're objective and fair, supposedly, in theory, you're appealing to everybody. And as a result of appealing to everybody, hopefully you've got better support. Generally speaking, when we come into the present, we're talking about a lot of shrinkage and fragmentation, and technology has been the driver. There used to be a much larger media press out there in terms of conventional or traditional media. Today, I think we've lost about 250 newspapers in this country in the last decade. That's the kind of shrinkage I'm talking about. A lot of them are disappearing, and some of them basically will never come back, especially if you're sitting in Hays, Kansas. And then the fragmentation is basically, if you're a newspaper today, you've got to be involved in electronic media in a whole variety of different ways. You can't just put out print media. I mean, we're talking about a lot of fragmentation in terms of who owns what, when, and when they got it. Those things basically are changing the media, and the media is trying to deal with it.
I've been greatly influenced by a book by Pierre Bourdieu called Language and Symbolic Power, which works, I think, really rather well for what we're talking about during our time. Symbolic power is basically the power that a person has that a culture invests in that person. Trump doesn't really have power except for the power that we permit him to have. Any leader doesn't really have any power except for the power that we permit that leader to have. And so I think about our cultural moment and how that has produced what we have in terms of a president. Not so much that Trump has done anything, but our cultural moment. And so how does he represent our cultural moment? So what kind of information environment or atmosphere do we live in? It's this cluttered world that we live in. And so we're at this moment where we're trying to find a way to organize the material to make sense, because we breathe that clutter. It informs our own behavior. And so that's what I find fascinating about Trump and the media. How much is he a product of what we live in?
The media is trying to figure out where it's going in life, what it's doing at this particular point in time, and that basically insecurity is also on Trump's side of the fence as well, because the guy says he's not a politician. We know he's a politician, but he really doesn't know what's happening in Washington, D.C. to a great extent. He's still trying to figure it out. And so that insecurity that he has from the 1970s and the 1980s, I'm saying to you, Trump basically was insecure long before he ever got to Washington. So that insecurity is there on both sides. Whatever the media can do to drum up business, they will. Whatever Trump can do to drum up business, he will do. The media is finding now that it was struggling to survive, but now it's thriving. I mean, things are really getting hot for the media. There's still the shrinkage and the fragmentation, but those that are surviving are making their way in the world much better since Donald Trump became president 7 months ago. So in some sense, the media likes what has happened because they're using the relationship basically to make themselves work. Journalistic standards, we talk about the objective model, and we talk about being fair enough, forget it. Trump has loosened up those standards to a great extent, and the media is making use of what's going on with regard to his conversation with the rest of the world.
I've noticed even in your guys' publications sometimes you'll refer to Barack Obama as President Obama, and then in the same next sentence say Mr. Trump. It's kind of the New York Times way of saying not my president. I'm wondering what you guys feel about that, and if, I don't know if everybody notices stuff like that, but just kind of your thought on that.
When I see some of the posts by Trump, you know, he kind of pats himself on the back for not conforming. They're trying to make me conform. They're trying to make me play this role, and I'm not going to play it. So there's a certain part of him himself that says, I'm not a president. I'm something different. You know, I'm something other. I am not inside politics. Nobody is going to make me play this part. And so I think about it as sort of part of the cultural atmosphere, you know, itself.
I was listening to an interview with prominent Black Lives Matter activist and former Detroit mayor candidate DeRay McKesson. She summed it up in a good line, and it was, I will claim him as my president when he claims me as one of his constituents. And it was along the lines of the policy that he wants to create and the message he brings does not include these specific kinds of people into his America. And so if they're not part of his America, he is not their president.
Dan referred to symbolic politics to some extent, about the use of symbols. I mean, that goes on all the time. Politicians use symbols and citizens use symbols in various ways to do the same thing in the other direction.
We all know,
Sorry, go ahead.
and we all know that President Trump is prevalent in using name-calling as a political tactic.
We don't expect our presidents to behave that way or to use those kinds of symbols or to use the kind of approach that Trump is using. I'm not saying that it's beyond the borders of what a president can do, but it's beyond the borders of what we expect the president to do, and that gap between the two has created a lot of the controversy and a lot of discussion, a lot of the noise that we've heard in various ways.
If we look at history, it'll correct itself. Something new is going to emerge based on how we manage information, what we do with information, and how we process information to turn it into knowledge. So I think we'll go through a decade or so of this transition part. So I really see this as a transition period in terms of what's going on with information and how we deal with information. We're in the process of correcting it, trying to do something with it. I was talking with Deb about changes to curriculum. How do we repackage information as part of what we're in the knowledge economy, aren't we? We are in that kind of business of trying to process information into knowledge so that we can move forward and make life better.
By 2050, America's democracy is going to have to basically bring together a lot of different identities, whether they're Hispanics or whether they're blacks or whether they're refugees from Syria or from Bangladesh or whatever it may be. We need to be able to put that all together with regard to identity politics, and we need to make sure that our history is correct, not only with Barack Obama, but with a variety of other folks as well. So,
what I would encourage is, rather than looking at, say, I need to be reading, equal amount of articles from both sides. I need to go to Fox and MSNBC. If you're really noticing, if it is really prominent, that kind of partisan bias, I would say curate that a little more based on the quality of the content, kind of what Brian was saying here. And you can find things of quality that lean kind of to one side or another. You want to look for that quality first and foremost, rather than something that immediately feeds into your own confirmation bias, your own desires for what you want to see.
thank you very much. Hopefully you have picked up a little bit of information to help you understand what Trump and the media are doing. If not, send us an email and Dan will answer it for you. Thank you.